I'm Anna Rebeck. I'm the social media strategist for the LSU Ag Center. And I'm excited to announce that we have Kevin Ringelman here joining us. He's the assistant professor of wildlife ecology. So Kevin, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. This should be fun.
Yes, definitely. So anyways, I just kind of want to talk about what you do first off and, talk about your research a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So my background has sort of been long steeped in waterfowl ecology. My dad was a waterfowl biologist for the Colorado Division of Wildlife and Ducks Unlimited for many years. And so I grew up on the prairies of North Dakota, hunting with my mom and my dad. And then I did my undergraduate education at Cornell University in New York, and then went straight to University of California, Davis for my PhD, did a quick postdoc at the University of Delaware, and then I've been here at LSU for almost 6 years now. So I've worked on waterfowl pretty much all over the United States. If you like ducks and wetlands, Louisiana is a pretty good place to end up.
That's fair enough. So before this, I actually did ask our audience on Facebook for some questions, and we got quite a few. So we'll start with some of these, and audience, y'all are welcome to chime in with any questions you have. So we'll start with, from Brandon, why are we seeing decreases in CRP, and what is CRP?
Good question, Brandon. So CRP stands for the Conservation Reserve Program. It's a conservation program that's part of the Federal Farm Bill. First Federal Farm Bill was passed in 1985 and is renewed every so often when Congress gets around to it. And so it's provision in the Farm Bill that encourages farmers to take mediocre land out of production and put it in grassland for the benefit of wildlife, especially ground nesting ducks. So CRP acres have been in decline since probably 2008. 2008, we were at a peak of about 8 million acres in CRP in the Prairie pothole region of the United States. So that's North and South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, parts of Montana. And from that 8 million acre peak, we're now down to somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 million acres. And the enrollment programs are 10-year programs. So the landowner will sign a 10-year contract saying, I'm going to leave it in grass. They can still graze it and things like that. But in 2008, corn prices went up dramatically. Part of that was the renewable fuel standard. So there was a big push by the federal government to use corn to make ethanol to blend in our gasoline. So all of a sudden, this land that wouldn't be profitable in a crop like corn all of a sudden became profitable, even though yields would be lower. And so farmers would not renew their CRP.
Oh, I think we're having a, okay. All right. Sorry, we had a stream issue there for a minute. What did you say that last part?
So since 2008, these acres have been in decline because these contracts are just not being renewed.
Gotcha. Yeah, thank you. And I just want to say we started just a little bit early, so I wanted to say hi to everybody again. We're doing another Live at 5 session. And we're doing these sessions, guys, because we can't meet face-to-face with people as much anymore. So we definitely want to bring the education, the research to y'all. And this is our Live at 5 duck session with Kevin Ringelman, assistant professor. I'm pointing the wrong way. And anyway, so y'all are allowed to ask questions, and we have some questions we took yesterday on Facebook. So our next question we'll go with is, this is from a homeowner, from Lacey. Will ducks ruin a garden? I plan to have a pond near a food garden, and I'm wondering if the ducks we attract won't in turn be a nuisance.
Probably not. So most of the waterfowl that we have in Louisiana are migratory, and so they're headed north at this time of year just to lay eggs and nest in the northern part of North America. Obviously, we have sort of like local park ducks and things like that, mallards and feral ducks around the city. But I don't think they're probably a big threat to gardens. Usually these birds are eating seeds or invertebrates from wetlands, or if they're park ducks, they're eating popcorn or whatever, right? And so generally what you are planting in your garden is not going to be appealing for those ducks. I mean, they might make a mess in terms of pooping in your yard or something. But yeah, I think you're probably safe to plant tomatoes and things like that.
Cool. Thank you for that one. So Kurt was asking, what is the latest time that a wood duck will lay eggs?
Good question. And I guess we'll find out. So I have a new project going on right now that is looking at wood ducks nest box use and nest success in some of the boxes that are maintained by Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries. And I say we'll find out because of all the geographies. You know, it's somewhere in the southern United States where we have a very long breeding season, and where those wood ducks they don't have to migrate anywhere further south, right? So they can lay eggs, I would think, certainly through July and maybe August, but definitely through July we'll see eggs. We see that even on the prairies.
Okay.
We'll have a very good answer for you next year.
Kurt will be appreciative of that one. We got a couple questions. So Jake's asking, any idea how duck numbers in Louisiana this past winter compared to those from the 2018-2019 season?
They were higher. So last year was pretty abysmal in terms of duck numbers, wintering duck numbers in Louisiana. Combination of warm weather in Louisiana and in places farther north. And even more importantly was record water flows. All stream gauges were effectively at flood stages in parts of Arkansas and Missouri. And so there was just a lot of water at those more northerly states. And all that water creates new flooded wetland habitat that the ducks can use. And so they had plenty of food, plenty of water, warm temperatures, and no reason to come down. And so I think the Louisiana duck harvest was something like half of what it usually was a couple seasons ago. But this past season, numbers were better. I guess I don't have the surveys in front of me right now, but I can tell you that they did seem to be higher.
Oh, awesome. William's asking, what's your top 3 tips for attracting and setting wood duck boxes around a pond?
So the good thing about wood duck boxes is if you build them for sort of the local birds to find those boxes, I think a more pertinent question is how do we make those boxes as successful as possible? And there are really good plans online, the right dimensions to make these boxes, to make sure they have proper ventilation, proper drainage, that the hole is the right size to permit wood ducks and deter other species. And then in terms of placement around the pond, a lot of research has demonstrated that the more visible a box is, the more likely it is to be parasitized by by a different wood duck. So we'll have multiple wood ducks that will lay eggs in a single box. And when that happens, those nest boxes less conspicuous, harder for other females to find, that tends to reduce levels of parasitism and can increase success.
Okay, awesome. We have a question from Katrina. She says, what do we do if we find an orphan duckling?
If you find an orphan duckling, you should probably leave it alone. So wood ducks, most dabbling have a brood of 6 to 10 ducklings, right? And so when they're startled, the mom will take her ducklings and go hide in vegetation. And so it may be that just one duckling got lost, right? And she'll come back for it. The other thing that's pretty common is when ducklings do sort of get lost more permanently, like mom doesn't find them, that another mom will actually adopt that duckling into her brood. So because there's really no cost of raising those offspring. And so what's one more fuzzy puffball, right? So the best thing that you can do is just leave those ducklings where you find them.
Cool. Mason's asking, I tend to have a snail problem in my garden. Will ducks eat snails?
Good question, Mason. So ducks will eat snails. Blue-winged teal can get after snails. Black ducks have been rumored to take them off of vegetation, like the snails climbing up the grass, and the black duck, it is claimed, will snatch the snail off the grass. So it is possible, but I know Mason does a lot of gardening, and I don't think the snails will get, or the ducks will get in and clean the snails off of his garden plants, however.
Tragic.
Yeah, tragic, right?
This was a really cool question. I was interested myself. I've seen huge flocks of ducks flying over the Pontchartrain Causeway during the winter. What species are those, and why are they there?
Good question. So most of those ducks are probably a species called lesser scaup. So they are one of the more common diving ducks that we have in Louisiana. And on Lake Pontchartrain especially, they can gather in huge concentrations. So LDWF flies aerial surveys over that lagoon, and in any given year, they'll count between 0 and more than 1 million ducks. So there's a huge variation in numbers. And that was actually one of my first projects here as an assistant professor, was trying to understand what causes the variation in those duck numbers. And so I had a master's student, Clay Stroud, who collected a bunch of birds to see what they were eating on the lake. And it turns out that they were eating a very specific size class of clam. These rangia clams, very small, in probably the less than 5 millimeter category. And so we tracked down a guy, a professor at the University of New Orleans, who's been, of all things, studying these clams for 30 years or something. And he had a really good long-term data set on how clam populations responded to things like hurricanes and the spillway opening, which is evidently going to happen again. Right. And so what we were able to do is deduce that when a hurricane rolls through New Orleans area, it mixes up the water in Lake Pontchartrain and the sediments and things, and basically buries these clams and kills them off. But the salinity from the storm surge actually induces them to breed as well, the ones that are remaining. And so the next year, after a hurricane, you get a bunch of these really little clams from the reproductive event, and that's when the scaup get in there to eat those clams. So it's kind of a cool story where there's this big environmental disturbance that then changes what the ducks are eating, and then the ducks respond the following year.
That's pretty cool. Okay, so that was the first project you worked on when you came here to LSU?
Yeah.
That's really, really neat. Okay.
Yeah, the fieldwork was tough because in order to lethally collect these birds, with a shotgun, you can't harvest them over decoys. Because a lot of research has shown that birds that come into your decoys are in poor body condition. They're basically almost starved. And so it's not a very representative sample. And so the only way that you can get that representative sample is to chase these birds down in high-speed boats on the lake and try to shoot at 20 or 30 miles an hour. And you can really only, so it's chaotic, right? Yeah. And you can only, and if any of the viewers have ever been out on the lake, if the wind is blowing more than 2 or 3 miles an hour, like, it's too choppy to run fast and shoot straight. So we were restricted to pretty calm days, and it was an adventure.
I bet so. Sounds like it. We're getting a few more questions, quite a few over here. Melanie's asking, is it okay to feed ducks bread?
It's not great. So that bread doesn't have the nutritional qualities that sort of natural duck food has, the necessary amino acids and proteins and things like that. If you throw them dry bread and things, it can expand in their stomach and cause gastrointestinal distress. And so what I always recommend is if you want to feed the park ducks, to feed them peas, like frozen peas that you get, at Albertsons. And that sort of is more nutritious than bread or crackers or popcorn or something like that.
I think that's a good one for the LSU community to learn about, as we have a lot of ducks there that people feed bread.
Yeah, I mean, on campus lakes, I was out there with a class early this semester, and somebody had just dumped a massive, like the giant movie-size bucket of popcorn out there for all of the squirrels and the geese and the ducks. And there was so much of it that they were satiated. They were no longer even interested in it.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Melanie. Hope that answers your question. Steven's asking, what impact can flooded corn throughout the flyway have on migration patterns?
Good question, Steven. So this is one that has come up, especially in Louisiana in the last few years. Some Louisiana duck hunters are concerned that the practice of flooding corn, especially in more northerly states, is holding large concentrations of birds that are then not making it down to the southern terminus of the flyway, which is us. most of the flooded corn that is happening on refuges and private lands in more northerly states is on too small a scale to hold any reasonable number of birds, right? And we're overwintering millions of ducks every winter. And so if a handful of thousand gets stopped by somebody's flooded cornfield, that's not really something that we can scientifically detect. Most of duck migration is, while it is dependent on food and natural food provided by green tree reservoirs, moist soil units, natural marsh along rivers and floodplains is really what's driving bird distributions. That in combination, very proximate factors like weather. Did it snow? If it snowed and everything is iced over, then the ducks can't forage in the water if there's a sheet of ice on it, right? And then there's some evidence that disturbance can affect the overall distribution of birds. So birds that are shot at too many times will move. That only makes sense.
Yeah,
right?
Makes sense for sure. We have another one from Shirley. She said, my huge hosta is in a very large pot on my patio, needs to be divided. It's just starting to come out. How do I do this? I think she's on the wrong. So we're on a duck Q&A today. I'm sorry, Shirley. Come back next Monday when we have a horticulture Q&A and our agents will be happy to help you. That's not the specialty of the day today. I'm sorry, but we'll come back to you on that on Monday. Katrina is asking, how will climate change impact ducks, specifically their nesting habit in the prairies?
Yeah, so climate change is forecast to have sort of unpredictable effects on ducks because one of the major impacts of climate change on the prairies is going to be increased variability. So things are going to get drier when they're dry and wetter when they're wet. And so that increased variability, for one thing, is really bad for farmers who don't do well in severe droughts or in severe storms or severe rainfall, snowfall, whatever it is. But it's going to mean some boom and bust years for ducks as well. There are some of the better climate forecast models suggest that it's the southeastern part of the prairies that's going to get wetter. And that's good for ducks, more ponds, more consistent water. But the problem is that is the geography where most of the grassland has been lost. So if we're talking about parts of Iowa and southern Minnesota, it's basically a cornfield, and ducks won't nest there. And so where conditions are going to improve is where the underlying habitat base does not exist.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see. Colette is asking, how will the new waters of the United States rule impact waterfowl?
Yeah, this is a scary one. So what she is referring to is the federal government, the EPA in particular, has redefined what constitutes a navigable waterway. So as part of the Clean Water Act, you are not allowed to fill in, you're not allowed to drain or fill or pollute a wetland that had a nexus or a connection to a navigable waterway. Well, so most of the small prairie potholes in the Dakotas, for example, are not physically by surface connected to like the Missouri River, right? But hydrologically, through groundwater, they are connected to some of these navigable waterways. Okay. And so there were, you needed to get a special Section 404 permit if you were a farmer who wanted to fill these wetlands. So it was like a regulatory block to keep water on the ground for ducks. The reinterpretation of this connection to navigable waterways means that it's been redefined so that only service connections count. So effectively, it's something like 2/3 of the wetlands that are important for ducks have lost that regulatory protection. And that's bad news.
Yeah.
Some of the policy changes that have happened at the federal level in recent years are probably likely to be reversed as the political tides change. But this is one that is potentially a problem right now, right? And so because it only takes 1 year for a farmer to go out and drain that wetland or fill it up, right? and then it's gone.
Right.
That can happen very quickly in 1 year. And I'm not disparaging, right, the farmers who want to do this. It's land that's not in production. They need to feed their families now more than ever, right? And so it's on the ground and let the farmers and ranchers who provide the majority of habitat for waterfowl in this country and in Canada to make sure that they're able to maintain their livelihood, because ducks need farmers and ducks need ranchers to keep grass on the ground.
Fair enough. It's a good answer. Ariel's asking, I'm curious if you know why some Muscovies are smaller than others. I know there's a giant gene. I'm assuming there is a dwarfing gene as well.
I'm just reading that question. I don't know. I think that there could be some sexual dimorphism. There could be juvenile birds. It could be nutrition. It could be genetic. There's lots of reasons that, if we move out of Muscovies into something like a mallard, there's, various reasons why you might shoot a 1,400 gram mallard versus an 1,100 gram mallard. And those are everything to do with the interaction of genetics and environment.
Fair enough. Lizzie said, why do some ducks migrate and others don't?
Interesting question. So in North America, migration is sort of the ancestral default, right? So the majority of the ducks that we have here in Louisiana during winter migrate north to breed. There are numerous sort of standard behavioral ecological hypotheses for why migration is adaptive. The one that fits waterfowl best is the resource flush hypothesis, which basically these prairie wetlands in the Dakotas and in Canada, when they're shallow, and so the ice melts very quickly, and they're some of the first areas to open up. And when they do, productivity of aquatic invertebrates and emergent vegetation is extreme. And so by migrating north, they can take advantage of those really abundant and ephemeral resources.
Okay. Yeah, that's awesome. Okay. Let's see. We have a lot of questions rolling in. Alex, I don't want to pronounce the name wrong, but I think it's Alexandre. How far do mottled ducks move throughout the year, and why has their population been in such decline in Louisiana?
Hey, Alex. Alex was helped us catch some of our first mottled ducks for Lizzie's project.
Cool.
So we have an active PhD project with mottled ducks where we are putting backpack-mounted GPS GSM transmitters, which collect GPS quality data and then transmit those data through the cell phone towers to an online portal where we can access it. And so this project has been going for 3 years now. And so we've got 130,000 locations on 100 and something ducks around the state of Louisiana. So we've gotten sort of really unprecedented look at what mottled ducks are doing throughout the annual cycle. So most of these mottled ducks are, for lack of a better word, very boring. They will pick a particular puddle. Actually, they'll pick a particular set of 3 puddles and move between them throughout the day for a couple months. And then seemingly for no reason, at least not tied to a big storm or a big front or a hunting season or anything like that, they will just pick up and move somewhere else in the state. So home ranges are pretty small. We're talking, a single rice farmer could easily encompass the home range of a mottled duck. But then some of these larger movements can be from, say, Rockefeller Refuge in southwestern Louisiana, almost to the Texas border, all the way to Venice. And then that bird will stay in Venice for months. We've had only, I think, 1 or 2 birds leave Louisiana and go to Texas. So there doesn't appear to be much movement across the border. And we've not seen any mottled ducks move to the other mottled duck population that's in Florida, and that's supported by a lot of the banding studies and a lot of the genetic studies that we have.
Okay. Brandon's asking, what regulations are in place to prevent negative human impacts to the boreal forest?
Good question. So The boreal forest is a big place. It's like 1.6 billion acres. And the boreal forest of Canada, it's the area that's north of the Aspen Parklands. It stretches all the way from Alaska to the eastern coast of Canada, and it's 99% in public ownership. It's mostly the Queen's land, or the Crown's land, this is called. And so it's subject to a number of threats. So logging is one of them, but at that size, it's not a huge issue, right? There's no way that we're going to chop down that many trees to make a meaningful impact on the ducks. Oil and gas activity, both oil sands and conventional drilling and fracking are potential threats, and the pipelines and the infrastructure and the transportation of that crude that's associated with that. Climate change is emerging as a big one, both in terms of impacting the interaction of waterfowl species and how they use those habitats. So, for example, some duck species that nest later, like scoters, scaup, they have a late window where they nest, and they need to be able to access the invertebrates when they plan to have their nests, right? And so what's happening with climate change is that ice out is occurring earlier in the boreal forest, which means the invertebrates are going earlier. And so there's a phenological mismatch between the timing of when, like, the scaup and the scoters need to be feeding their ducklings, and the invertebrates have already hatched out. That flush has already happened. So that's one threat. Okay. The other threat is directly from climate change and its effect on forest fires. So this past summer was horrible for forest fires in Alaska and the boreal forest of Russia. And so forest fires, more than logging, say, has the potential to wipe out vast stretches of forest. And those fires will become more frequent and more severe. So what's being done about it is a lot of really good and innovative work by mostly Ducks Unlimited and DU Canada in partnership with the federal government of Canada, provincial governments, and especially the native people, the native tribes of Canada. So a lot of these native tribes actually haven't finalized their treaties with the Canadian government. And as part of the requirements for these treaties, they need to have a land use plan. So how they are going to discharge of the areas that they're being given control of. That's, are some going to be protected? Are some going to be for resource extraction, oil and gas, right? Are some going to be hunted or not hunted? And so Ducks Unlimited, along with a bunch of charitable partners, have come together to really work with these indigenous people to use their local knowledge for where the ducks are, what resources are important for wildlife that they see. And then from the US and sort of Canada NGO side, they're providing some spatial mapping tools and climate change forecasts that can help those native people make the best decision for their tribe. And so that's how a lot of these large swaths of the boreal forest are being protected. And we're talking about deals that are 6 million acres of protected land. That's the overarching strategy, is to protect large swaths of land so that as things change, ducks have some place to go.
Wow, that's really cool. Mike is asking, thoughts on North Louisiana getting more of a residential group of Canadian geese? I'm now seeing them in the smallest of beaver ponds.
Yeah, and a lot of the Canada geese that we have now are residents. So historically, we would have the migratory population of Canada geese that breed in Hudson Bay and sort of all over in northern Canada migrate down to Louisiana, and now those birds are wintering farther north. They're wintering in Chicago, in North Dakota, and so so most of the expansion of Canada geese that Mike's referring to are these resident birds that are hanging out on beaver ponds, golf courses, nursing home yards, people's backyards. We've got 2 or 3 flocks of them in Baton Rouge. There's sort of one over on Seagan by the mall, right? And there's one by the golf course on LSU Lakes, and they are increasing in number.
That's interesting. Okay. Megan's saying, or actually, Megan says, Clay Strude, with emerging technologies such as drones being integrated into wildlife management programs, could they be, or how are they used for any waterfowl management?
Good question. So drones have the potential to revolutionize a lot of wildlife ecology, spatial ecology. There are some researchers out of the University of North Dakota who are using fixed-wing drones to survey for large colonies of Arctic nesting birds like snow geese. And there's been a lot of success in surveying colonial birds with drones. There's been it's been suggested that drones could take over some of the large-scale aerial surveys that state and federal agencies fly, like on the breeding grounds or wintering surveys, aerial surveys here in Louisiana. I don't see that being feasible immediately, just because of the inherent difficulty with identifying birds at high speed in large numbers as they're flying away is pretty tough. My research group is using quadcopter drones, more like the ones that you would get, at Best Buy, to study nesting ducks on the prairies. So our drones are equipped with both visual and thermal imaging cameras. And so with that thermal camera, we can actually detect the heat signature given off by an incubating female on the nest. But especially, we can see those little ducklings that are swimming in the emergent vegetation. So as I alluded to with the duckling question earlier, when these birds are disturbed, they swim into the vegetation and hide, and they're very good at what they do. And so as biologists, when we want to go out and be able to count the number of ducklings to evaluate nest success or brood success, right, it's very hard to get an accurate estimate. And so with these thermal imaging cameras, what we're finding is ground observers are not seeing most of the broods. They're missing about half of what's actually out there.
Wow.
And so it's a pretty cool application of technology that we could have never envisioned 5 years ago, that you could stick a thermal camera on a drone and hover it over a wetland in Minnedosa, Manitoba, and count ducklings. Right?
When did y'all start doing that, using the technology?
That was probably 3 years ago.
Okay.
I just graduated a master's student, and I have another one who's working in North and South Dakota doing some of the same work. They're also really good for getting aerial images of wetlands. So you can put a biologist and a camera on an airplane, right, and fly them over wetlands, and they can take pictures. But it's expensive. Putting people in small airplanes is dangerous, and you can't really do it more than once a year. But here, if you're interested in, say, how fast a wetland dries down between May and August,
right,
you can just pop the drone up and take pictures at a fixed height, stitch them together, and quantify how much water is in there, what is the buffer zone of emergent vegetation, how large is that? So there's a lot of cool applications for this aerial technology, and it's advancing rapidly. When we started, the batteries only afforded us a flight time of maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and now we're up to 25 minutes. So, it's a doubling of efficiency in the span of 3 years.
That's really neat. Jake's asking you, how are conditions on the Prairie pothole region shaping up for the nesting season?
Good question. Variable. The reports that I've been hearing is that southern Canada is dry, and then I think we're still in the range where we can get some rainfall that makes a difference. The report from my dad in North Dakota yesterday, the water looked pretty good. Our backyard ponds were full, and there were many thousands of ducks on them. Cool. So I'm hopeful for a good year.
That's awesome. William says, do you feel that the Maurepas Wildlife Management Area will become better for ducks with the freshwater diversion project?
Good question. I'm not super familiar with the Maurepas Wildlife Management Area in sort of reference to where it is with respect to the proposed diversion. A lot of things are going to change when that diversion goes in, right? As a general rule, the fresher habitats tend to provide higher quality duck food, and they tend to support a larger diversity of duck species. So to the extent that the Moorpaw WMA becomes fresher and with better water control in the years to come. I don't know how long that will take. That's potentially beneficial for ducks, I would say. And of course, there's any mechanism by which we can build marsh and sort of slow, the loss of our coastline is very critical for ducks in Louisiana.
Makes sense. Matt's asking, 20 years ago, I rarely saw black-bellied whistling ducks in Louisiana. Now they're very common. What's going on there, and does their expansion pose a threat to other cavity nesting ducks?
Yeah, black-bellied whistling ducks are crazy. They're a rapidly expanding species in Louisiana and throughout the United States. I think they've been documented in 40-something states. And so they're just sort of pioneering in areas where we never expected. So it's a species that is very distinct from other dabbling ducks and diving ducks. They're in their own subfamily. They are native to Central and South America. They've always sort of had populations in parts of southern Texas, trickling in Louisiana. They were knocked back pretty good in the 70s because of pesticides, especially aldrin that was sprayed on rice crops, sort of the silent spring effect, right? And we banned all those nasty pesticides, and they've been expanding ever since. Blackbellies and fulvous whistling ducks. Black-bellied whistling ducks much more so. And so, yeah, so they are... they really like agricultural fields. They're not quite as rice specialists as fulvous, but that's generally where we see them. But they're common now in South Louisiana year-round. They're common in North Louisiana for most of the year. And where many of them will leave during winter, right around October-ish. Mm-hmm. They will go to places unknown. It's a bird we don't know a lot about, but then they are back at this time of year to start nesting. They can nest either on the ground or in natural cavities created by woodpeckers or something, or in boxes like those that we put up for wood duck boxes. And so one of the goals that I have with the wood duck project that we have now is to evaluate the degree to which these whistling ducks could be competing with wood ducks for nest sites and or parasitizing them, or I've heard anecdotal reports of whistling ducks actually harassing and killing wood duck ducklings. So it's an area that we just don't know much about. And so that is one of the emerging research priorities for me, at least, in Louisiana.
Fair enough. We had another one from Brandon earlier. He said, with the decrease in CRP enrollment in the PPR and more nesting grounds being turned into agricultural fields, what can we expect to see in the future as far as waterfowl being successful, both nesting and long-term populations?
Good question. Wish I had a crystal ball. Ducks are, one of the things that's amazing about ducks is that they are so highly adaptable. They do pretty well, and they've done pretty well given what's happened to the prairies, not just CRP, but just conversion of native prairie to agriculture since the 1980s. I mean, we're effectively at record duck numbers. The all-time record was a couple years ago or something, but we're effectively still there. And that's in the face of grassland conversion into agriculture. Ducks are non-territorial in selecting nest sites, meaning that a gadwall and another gadwall will nest 8 feet away from each other. But they're very particular about their wetlands. They are territorial about wetlands. And so the reason that the prairies are so productive is that, and they can support such large densities of ducks, you've got a whole bunch of these little prairie potholes, and every pothole can support one mallard, one gadwall, one blue-wing, one shoveler, and then the next pothole can support one mallard, one blue-wing, one gadwall, shoveler, right? But if they were consolidated to one wetland, they would only be able to support one pair of each species. And so from my perspective, I think a more immediate concern is water. Water helps maintain that carrying capacity. So water maintains carrying capacity, and grassland produces ducks. And so they're both important issues. And it's difficult to know which is which is going to be driving duck populations in the future. I think waters is really important, and water is going to be, it's already consolidation issues and flooding problems in Canada are already rearing their ugly head and getting the attention of provincial governments and things like that. And so I think water issues are going to be fought over first before grass issues. I think.
Okay. Fair enough. Lacey is saying, where's your duck cat, first off? And how many years of experience is needed to obtain a bird banding permit by USFWS?
Okay, I brought the duck hat just in case somebody asked.
Gotta wear the duck hat.
All right, so this is, my wife is a professional knitting designer, and so she wanted, I wanted a duck hat, and I wanted it to be 3-dimensional, and so here we are.
You have to wear the duck hat for at least 2 minutes now. I'm sorry.
Okay, I will wear the duck hat. Oh. I brought it into the room, so.
This is pretty cool. No one else has come in with a duck hat or anything else. Like, that's pretty amazing that you're I like it. But yeah.
So Brett wanted a turkey hat. I knew you guys did a turkey talk.
Yeah.
But so far she has resisted the urge to knit Brett a duck hat or a turkey hat.
Poor Brett.
Yeah, I know. He's pretty bummed about it. Lacey's asking how many years is needed to obtain a bird banding permit by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So, like, I do my bird banding under the permit that's issued to Larry Reynolds, who's a state waterfowl biologist. And so he has what's called a master bander permit. And that means that you're in charge of maintaining the records and knowing where the bands are, sort of making sure that scientific integrity is being followed, all of this, right? It's not necessary so you can band under those permits with permission, and there's a process for that for the bird banding lab to get your own master bander permit. As the name would imply, you need to have substantial experience in banding birds. And I'm not even sure if it's a year requirement, but it's probably definitely an experience requirement. It probably has to do with there's what you can demonstrate that you've done in the past to make sure that you can do it ethically and safely.
Fair enough. And
my head is getting hot.
I bet so. And I think we will end on that question. And if you want to bring your family in, and if they want to be on screen for a minute, you're welcome to bring them in, tell them hi.
If they hear you, they'll come in.
All right.
They must not be watching.
Yeah, fair enough. If not, thank you again for being here and answering a lot of duck questions. And I think everybody really enjoyed it, learned a lot about ducks. I certainly did. I did not know very much about ducks, so I appreciate that. And
this is good.
Anyways, hope to have you back sometime as well.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you, Kevin.
Stay safe, everyone.
Uh-huh.